want to welcome back to This Day, as always, our regular guest, Dr. John Hovannisian from Harvard Eye Associates. Thanks for joining us.
Good to see you, Michael, always.
Now, we hear a lot about Ozempic and Wegovy, and it's like, why were we talking to an eye doctor about that kind of stuff? But there is maybe, needs more study, but maybe a slight link between taking those drugs and those like them and a form of blindness.
Yeah, so this is an interesting news story that's received a lot of attention, partly because these drugs are so wildly popular now. And this study relates just to one of the drugs, which is known as Ozempic or Wegovy, which is semaglutide. And it's in a class of drugs that are widely used now called the GLP-1 agonists. So they work in glucagon-like peptide receptors. So that's a mouthful. But so what happened in this study is, it's interesting the way it came about. A neuro-ophthalmologist, that's an ophthalmologist who specializes in optic nerve diseases, at Harvard happened to, and not Harvard Eye Associates, but at
the actual Harvard.
The other Harvard. The other Harvard.
Those East Coasters.
The East Coast Harvard. Yeah, the real Harvard, which is called Massachusetts Eye and Ear Infirmary. Noticed 3 patients in a week who were in the clinic who had a condition that is pretty rare. It's called non-arteritic anterior ischemic optic neuropathy. That's also a mouthful. But it's basically a stroke in the front of the optic nerve, where the optic nerve enters inside the eye, where blood flow is temporarily restricted. And he happened to notice that all 3 of these patients were taking one of these drugs, and I think all 3 of them were taking.
Semaglutide involved in all of these, right?
That's right. And so he said, you know what, we ought to take a look at our records. So we went back and reviewed 17,000 records of patients who had been seen in their clinic over the years to see which of them developed this non-arteritic anterior ischemic optic neuropathy and what other conditions they had. And they found some interesting trends. And this is really does not prove cause, and it does not prove a risk of these drugs, but it certainly provokes further study. And so what they found is that these drugs are primarily used for treating patients who need weight loss, and in some cases for people with diabetes. And that among people with each of those conditions, the likelihood of developing this stroke in the optic nerve was in the group of diabetics about 4 times higher. It went from about 2% to about 8% if you took that, just the populations they looked at as a cross-section.
Right.
Among people who were taking the drug for weight loss, or people who were, so you took people who were being treated for weight loss either with this type of drug, a GLP-1, or without it, with another method, they were about 7 times higher likelihood. So it went from 0.8% among those taking other types of medications to almost 7% in the patients who were taking Wegovy. So interesting that it was a higher incidence.
Right. And it's so rare, it's still a very small number of people across the country and maybe around the world that are having this effect, but it's still something it's a blip. In there.
Yeah, it's an interesting data point. So non-arteritic anterior ischemic optic neuropathy, or NAAION, as it's called, happens in about 1 in 40,000 people in the general population. So it is not a common condition at all, and that's why what piqued the interest is 3 patients in a week with a condition that only affects 1 in 40,000 people caught his attention. But further studies needed, and it just goes to show that when a new drug is approved, and this could apply to other drugs in this class. We don't know everything there is to know about it.
And this is long-term use. So, I mean, those studies don't go this far out. They don't 5-10 years down the line, and they've been out for a little while now. At least these initial ones, right? Yeah,
they've been out for a little while, but not as long as they will be. They're going to be around for probably a very long time. And the positive side of these drugs is that for people with diabetes and with weight loss, they really work like no other drugs do. And there have been some dramatic results, favorable results that a lot of patients have. They're expensive, and coverage with insurance is challenging in many cases for patients, and so that limits the access to these drugs. And yet they're wildly popular, and they are working well for a lot of our patients. We're seeing a lot of folks with diabetic retinopathy who are keeping their disease under control because of these drugs.
Right, there's some major benefits here. Now, did they notice or did they detect any folks in terms of gender or age or anything like that were more susceptible to it?
Yeah, great question. So So in the study, there were no particular outliers in terms of gender or other risk factors. But in general, and we should talk a little bit about NAION so that people just understand what it means, it happens in people who have some of the same conditions we use these drugs to treat. So people, compared to the general population, you're more likely to have NAION whether or not you take one of these drugs if you are diabetic, if you have high blood pressure, if you have lipid problems, if you have sleep apnea, if you have some of this constellation of different conditions that tend to go together in the same group of patients. And so we don't completely understand why that occurs, but it has to do with blood flow, just like a stroke in the brain can occur because small vessels get damaged by these diseases. The small vessels in the optic nerve can become damaged, limit blood flow, and cause this type of stroke. And the reason we think, some people say, well, why would these drugs cause this? Again, we don't know completely, but there are a couple of reasonable theories. One is that there are GLP-1 receptors inside the optic nerve. And so it's possible that the drug's acting directly on those receptors is having some effect on blood flow. Another theory is that just simply these drugs do affect blood flow in the microvascular structures in small blood vessels. And so that could be, it could be affecting other parts of the body. It's just that when it occurs right in the front of the optic nerve, boy, it gets your attention because it robs you of your vision.
So if someone is stricken with NAION, are there symptoms that are coming? Is it both eyes and you're just blind? Is it irreversible? Is there treatment? What are some of the things that you need to look at there?
Yeah, great question. So NAION typically occurs in one eye, but about 10% of the time it can occur later in the second eye. It doesn't usually occur in both eyes at the same time. It is painless. It is quick. It most typically occurs when people first wake up. They notice it, although it probably occurs at night, just like many strokes occur in the late hours of sleep. Our blood pressure tends to peak in the morning, and so many times people wake up with stroke symptoms. And similarly, this occurs. It does not always rob them completely of the vision in the eye that's affected, but it may reduce it significantly. So you might not be able to, it might drop it to the 20/50, 20/70, 2200 level, to a level that is not functional for reading or, in that eye for seeing things. So you may still have the other eye as long as the condition doesn't develop in the other eye, but it's a tough disease. In terms of improvement and treatment, we don't have any great treatments for it, unfortunately.
Are there some experimental treatments out there? Maybe there's some things they're working on because it's so rare. I imagine there's not a lot of funding in that area.
Well, that's true, but it's also just over the years in treating it, we haven't come up with anything. Just like with a stroke, when you have blood vessel damage in the brain, we can try to bust the clot. We've got drugs, if you catch it early enough, that we can intervene and maybe prevent further damage. But once the damage has occurred, we don't have great ways of restoring neurologic function in these delicate tissues. So of people who get NAION, about a third actually get a little worse over time. About a third stay about the same, and about 1/3 get a little bit better. And there are very few cases where it completely resolves. There's usually some deficit that remains, but some people fortunately do get better. So if you take one of these drugs, it's probably worthwhile to have an eye exam just to check your eyes. An eye exam is not going to be able to tell you whether you're going to get this condition or not, to be fair, but it's worthwhile to make sure you don't have other conditions like glaucoma that may increase your risk of NAION, and to just be careful with your health. Take care of yourself.
As another way we can reduce the risk is also controlling blood pressure and diabetes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is strangely enough what some of those drugs are meant to do.
Yeah. So, by losing weight, we have an easier time controlling blood pressure. We have an easier time controlling blood sugar. And of course, these drugs work directly on blood sugar control as well, not just through weight loss.
Over at Harvard Eye, you guys are full gamut service. Let's talk a little bit about how long you guys have been around and all those.
Well, thanks for asking. Celebrating 50 years. Actually, July. We just finished the month. Harvard Eye was founded in July of 1974. So this past month was our 50th anniversary, but we're celebrating all year long. It's not too many medical practices have been around 50 years. I've been part of the practice about half of that. When I joined, we had 4 doctors. Now we're close to 20. And every single one of them is a fine human being, a great person, and somebody I'd be proud to have take care of my family or myself.
Fantastic. And folks, that's a heck of an endorsement. He works there, but it's still a heck of an endorsement. John Hovannisian from Harvard Eye Associates, thank you so much for joining us today.
Michael, great to see you. Great to spend a little time with you.
Absolutely. You're watching This Day. We'll be right back.